That's right.
On the political offensive and moving into enemy terrain. So Keir Starmer began the new year trying to snatch a slogan he once opposed. Vote Leave's Brexit clarion call, take back control.
The control people want is control over their lives and their communities. We will spread control out of Westminster, devolve new powers over employment support, transport, energy, climate change, housing, culture, childcare provision, and how councils run their finances. All this will be in a new Take Back Control bill, a centrepiece of our first King's speech.
Back in the Brexit referendum, devolving powers to local government wasn't how the slogan was usually used.
We can take back control of our immigration system.
Keir Starmer insisted a Labour government would address the wider rejection of top-down politics, which the slogan tapped into.
Some kind of political credit.
The Labour leader said any government he led would be built around long-term missions to renew Britain. But that didn't mean reckless spending.
Let me be clear. None of this should be taken as code for Labour getting its big government chequebook out. Of course investment is required. I can see the damage the Tories have done to our public services as plainly as anyone else. But we won't be able to spend our way out of their mess. It's not as simple as that.
Do you think there's more scope for the private sector delivering public services? Have we reached the outer limits of it? Is it sometimes what works? Could there be a whole new development in that under your premiership?
What I'm proposing today, what we've put on the table, is a partnership model where, with the an agile, active state working in partnership with private business, we deliver together, each clear about what their role is in that partnership. And that's the way in which we deliver for the future.
Harold Wilson remains one of only 3 Labour leaders to win an outright majority in a general election in the party's entire history. ASLEF rail workers picketed at Huddersfield Station in front of his statue today. The government tried to make Keir Starmer's efforts to get into number 10 harder by challenging him to back the government's new planned law requiring strikers, from nurses and paramedics to train drivers, to provide minimum service during walkouts.
There has to be a minimum safety level that people can expect even on strike days, particularly in areas like healthcare, making sure that an ambulance can turn up, for example. That's very patchwork at the moment. Other modern European economies all have minimum safety levels, and we've announced that we'll be introducing those in legislation, in law, today as well.
I don't think this legislation is going to work, and I'm pretty sure they've had an assessment that tells them that it's likely to make a bad situation worse. Obviously, we'll look at what they bring forward, but if it's further restrictions, then we will repeal it. And the reason for that is I do not think that legislation is the way that you bring an end to industrial disputes. You have to get in the room and compromise.
As well as putting minimum service requirements into law for sectors like rail, the government said it would seek voluntary agreements in areas like education and border security, but impose new laws if there was no agreement.
Happy New Year. Thank you very much.
The Labour leader said the government needed to compromise with unions on pay deals, suggesting a new demand on the chequebook he promised to control. And Keir Starmer did say his party's pledge to abolish university tuition fees was now under review.
Well, we'll get government reaction to the Labour leader's speech later in the programme. But first, I've been speaking to Nigel Roebuck of the train union, ASLEF. Their driver strike today has pretty much brought trains to a halt across the country. I began by asking him if he heard anything from the Labour leader today that makes him feel Keir Starmer is more on board with the strike action.
I think the interesting part for me today was the fact that, any kind of anti-trade union laws that the Conservative Party are looking to bring in, that he would repel. So we welcome that. Obviously, most of my day's been spent on picket lines today, so I've not had the overview totally of it. But, obviously, I welcome that news.
On exactly that point, this is going to make life very difficult for you, isn't it? The Prime Minister has made it quite clear he is going to push ahead with anti-strike legislation, which could see unions and union members sued or bosses finding it easier to sack striking workers. You can't fight that, can you?
I think the interesting thing is it really does sum up what this government's about at the moment. I think, rather than getting round the table or allowing the companies in our industry to talk to us and find a way out of this dispute by settling, the argument on both sides, yet again, they're running to the courts. It just almost seems like very typical of this government that all they want to do is deflect away from reality.
Well, what the government say they want to do is that they want to ensure minimum service. They're saying that there has to be a balance between maintaining a minimum service and your right to strike. And the public will support that, surely.
I'm not so sure they will. I mean, at the end of the day, it's back to the argument about what's safe on the railway with people on overcrowding trains. What you can't predict in minimum service levels is how many people are going to arrive for one train, and if 100% of the passengers decide to arrive for 20% service that's offered, you're facing overcrowding, then it becomes unsafe.
One of the things that was striking about Keir Starmer's speech today, he did talk about strikers, very specifically and only about striking nurses. Now, cynics might say he thinks it's politically easy to talk about nurses. There's more sympathy for them than there is for your train drivers.
I think, the emotion around the NHS is massive. It's the big subject out there. But you know what? As a trade unionist, I look at it a different way. I think every working person that's struggling in a cost of living crisis deserves a pay rise.
But it's interesting that he only talks about nurses, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's his prerogative because it's a big ticket subject to talk about, and he knows that likely the public support's going to be more towards the NHS. But in general, I've found when I've been travelling around the picket lines today and the last few months that the public support is there for working people in general rather than stereotyping a different sector.
But is there a difficulty? It's been raised many, many times. I know you've had to answer this many, many times. The average salary of a train driver is around 50,000, which is much more than average pay across the country.
One of the things that we've been very clear on is it's not a race to the bottom. By saying that somebody on a higher salary should have less of a pay rise means that the person on the lowest salary is going to get a higher pay rise. It's not like that. At the moment, nobody's getting anything.
But what do you say to the public whose lives are being disrupted?
The public support is there. I think people are sympathetic because the majority of people that use trains are people that are working people, and they're probably struggling as well in a cost of living crisis. So the answer is, we need to find a resolution. It could be solved if, the government allow the companies and the DfT allow the companies that we negotiate with to talk to us.
Nigel Roebuck, thanks very much for coming in to talk to us today.
You're welcome.